G'day guys, I'm Totally Zoo and welcome back to Wirradale Zoo. So today we are continuing where we left last time with the Jewels of Asia section of Wirradale Zoo. We are going to be adding the new species, which again, as you'd have seen in the thumbnail and the title, we are adding the Chinese Pangolin. So this leads on to, I think, an important facet of the zoo, which we'll be working on an ongoing basis, which is having subsections of the zoo. So obviously the pear David's deer is from China, as is the Chinese pangolin. So we are adding the Encounter China section of the zoo, and this is going to be a subzone of the Jewels of Asia section. So I think that's going to be necessary due to the number of species that we're looking to add with this. Obviously we're aiming to add every single species that's in the game, so we're unlikely to have 45 or so Asian species all in one section of the zoo that has no further dividing areas. So we're dividing it up into just the Chinese species, and then we'll divide it up into other areas as well from there, which will help to add some cohesiveness across the zoo while still keeping them within the overall Asia section, which I think is really similar to what zoos around the world do. This is just probably a little bit larger compared to what you would get in real zoos. So as you can see, we added the Chinese theming for the Encountered China section there. It's really basic, and I wasn't trying to do anything over the top there. I personally haven't seen many zoos that go for really grandiose architecture. They tend to work more towards the style of the habitat itself rather than looking at the surroundings. But there are some amazing zoos that I've seen overseas from where I live, but also people have created in Planet Zoo that I think look great. So I think we'll aim for a bit of a mix of that. I think some of the habitats that we work on will have really grandiose architecture, but it'll probably be some of the more exciting ones, some of the big draw type habitats. It won't be all of them, and certainly things like having a simple sign at the side of the path is, I think, really quite basic. So as you've seen, we divided the building for the pangolins into two areas, and I'm just building a custom door here just to divide those up, because what we're going to be looking at with the pangolins is the fact that oftentimes they will be kept in a solitary quarters. They're not the most social animals, and so from the reading I've been doing, they will often be kept on their own, and they might be brought together at certain times of the year when the zoo determines that they are ready to mate, and so we can have that ready for them then. But for the most part, the zoo would probably be keeping them separate. So we'll have both of them side by side, but the fact that we're playing a video game means that we can just keep the dividers open at all times, and basically you can get the impression from seeing those dividers that they could be shut when necessary, but they just never will be, because it's a little more interesting to see them when they're able to interact with each other, and you're more likely to actually see them. They are obviously shy animals, so they mightn't be out as often, so having double the chance of seeing them when they're capable of interacting and everything just gives a little bit more life to the exhibit. So we're doing a fairly basic concrete walls. I was looking at different care manuals for these guys, and they're not easy to find, but the main one I found was talking about they need really thick concrete to try to prevent them from digging through. And a few other details, such as they need concrete lining underneath about a meter of their substrate as well. So small things like that. I wanted to basically hint at that as I built. So one of the things that we'll see later is I add a bit of a hole in the ground that you can imagine that the pangolin has dug, and there's a bit of concrete underneath it there that you see, which I think is just a small little touch, but those small things do go a long way with these builds. Now, most pangolin habitats I've seen are fully indoors, and I think part of that is because the habitats that actually exist, there's a few in Asia, and the ones that I've seen videos of are both in Europe, and I'm guessing that the pangolins wouldn't really like the European climate. So given that this zoo is set in Australia, we are capable of having a little bit of an outdoor section. The indoor section would be fully climate controlled and everything, but we can afford to put this section outdoors and just have that option for the pangolins if they want it. This was something I read about in the care manual I was reading, and it was talking about how if you have an outdoor section, you need a very tight mesh, and you also need the thick concrete walls up to a certain height. So that leads me directly into the building tip for today, which is to look up care manuals for the species you're building for. So personally, I'm susceptible to a bit of choice paralysis. When you've got so much freedom to build whatever you like, it can be hard sometimes to choose the right options and feel like you're making a selection that really works, and you've got a bit of too much choice, which limits what you can do. So I find that if you look up a care manual and you find the requirements for these animals limits what you can actually build, then you can actually have an easier time building your habitat. So with these pangolins, knowing about their social structures, knowing about the fact they need thick concrete walls, knowing about their diet requirements, knowing about their susceptibility to stress, and therefore the need to have some areas to hide in the back areas, things like that. Here's an example on screen right now. The care manual said that they absolutely need these bed boxes for some areas to hide and some privacy. So something really simple, but it gives you a bit of inspiration on what to build, but also in some ways it limits what you can do, which for me at least makes it a bit easier to find a jumping off point to start with, and then you can use those limitations to actually help give you some inspiration. So we're adding some of the basic things like the trim and the decals on the outsides of the concrete here, and we play around with a few different colors. We end up on this sort of slightly pink one, which I think worked fairly well with the facade that I'm adding here, just this sort of Chinese style. It's very much not meant to be a faithful recreation of what you might see in an actual Chinese building. I have no idea if it would be, but it's basically reminiscent of that fact, and it would also be not too expensive for the zoo to actually make this, which is a consideration. I would rather the zoo spend more money on the care for the animals than on the huge pieces of architecture. And obviously for the big animals like the lions and elephants, which would be bringing a lot of money into the zoo, they could probably afford to give them a little bit more of a grandiose piece, because that is more likely to draw in the guests as well. So the pangolins are a really unfortunate species in Planet Zoo in some ways, because they can't climb, and in real life they are really adept climbers. They actually have prehensile tails. It's really interesting, but in game they basically have no hint of that fact. So what I wanted to do with this habitat was give them the ability to climb, even though the game won't actually let them. So this area here, as you can see, we're sort of checking the traversable area for the pangolins. I wanted to add a fairly basic ramp, which could then be connected to a series of non-functional climbing pieces, such as the one you're seeing here. This doesn't have any function in the game, I should say, but in real life they would be able to climb and clamber about on these things. So having at least some element of that climbing is, I think, a nice way to reference the way they actually live. It's a bit unfortunate, given that they are base game species, they probably didn't have as much attention to detail as some of the later DLC species got, and that's something that we see a decent amount. The West African lion is pretty notorious for not having the most incredibly well-made designs, but oh well. So these small pieces I added, I just copied and pasted around the place, and they could, in theory, climb around on those. This here is something that I really wanted to do, is to add a bit of a framing with the plant life in the habitat. So the ponytail palm is Old Reliable, and we add the other Old Reliable, which is the Scaevola bushes, as well later on. But these provide a nice way to sort of shield the edges of the habitat, and for the pangolins themselves, it gives them a little bit more ability to sort of hide and a little more coverage that the guests wouldn't be able to see around. And as you can see, we sort of spend a bit of time trying to make sure that it's not fully blocking the view. That would defeat the purpose of having a zoo, but it's giving them a little bit more coverage, and also just looks nice having that sort of framing going on. Because the pangolins are diggers and they go around and like to dig up a bunch of the dirt, I thought it might be nice to also have the plant life at the front, where the pangolins are less likely to be, just because they will be avoiding the noises of the crowd. So we can add the plants up here at the front, where they're less likely to have been disturbed as well. Now, as we spend a bit of time working on the terrain and plant life and other detailing within the habitat, I wanted to talk about something that I'm always interested in, which is real life zoos. So obviously, as you can tell by my voice, and as I've mentioned before, I'm from Australia, so not only do we have less zoo life than what you would see overseas, we also have a bit of a difficulty going from one zoo to another. So different zoos will be 8-10 hours travel apart, or a very expensive plane ticket apart. So it can be harder to travel around and see some of the zoos around the country, let alone overseas. So as someone who is really keen to eventually see some of the best zoos in the world, I'd love to hear people's thoughts as to what the best options are, and if you've got any advice. If I was to travel, what's the best places to go? Singapore Zoo is relatively close, and that's one that I do plan on going to see. I think they're working on combining all of their zoos into one big unit, which would be amazing. But if I were to travel to the US or to Europe, which of those picks should I do? What has the best zoos and that type of thing? So if you've got any advice, my advice for you, if you come to Australia, Monarto Zoo is really cool. It's got the open range zoo, and that's what the entrance to Wirradale Zoo is based on. And the Taronga Zoo in Sydney is pretty incredible. They have a lot going on, and just in terms of the view alone, you can see over the harbour of Sydney, and there's a lot going on. It's a really cool trip to go over there. So I definitely recommend those two. But to be honest, most of the Australian zoos are very well made. They just have a lot of overlap with their species. Not that that's a bad thing, but as someone who wants to see wide varieties of animals, it would be cool to see more. So please do share any advice you've got, and if you ever come to Australia, that's my advice for you. Now, as you can see, we've started adding the basic fencing at the front of the habitat here. Again, that just adds a little more divide between the guests and the pangolins, and we want to have them at our highest priority there in terms of avoiding stressing them out. I add the education board here, and I felt like that was slightly blocking the education thing I had in the background. So these education boards would be a really simple, just saying this is a pangolin and a really brief synopsis of what's going on with it. And this one in the background would be going into a bit more detail about the difficulties that wild pangolins are facing in terms of being hunted to near extinction. And it would be probably advocating for a fundraising charity and that type of thing as well. I added this style on the roof, which I thought was quite a good way of basically limiting some of the light that comes into the building. Pangolins obviously tend to be more nocturnal species, so it's not a bad way to set it up so that they have a little bit of a darker surround, and they might be a little active, particularly during the morning and evening at the zoo. Now, I gave up on having paths that went closer to the mesh in the outdoor areas there. Again, we just want to limit the ability for the guests to get too close to the pangolins and minimize their stress. I actually end up making the fencing there a little bit tighter. It feels a little weird looking there where it goes a little beyond where the habitat actually is, so I make that a little smaller, and you'll see that in the cinematics at the end. Now, something that I was a little uncertain about doing was adding this sort of background foliage. This is something that actually adds a lot to the zoo itself, in my opinion. Blocks off some sight lines and just makes things look more real. Obviously at the moment, if we look up into the distance, usually it's just a really flat expanse of grass with the way that the zoo looks right now. So being able to cut off some of those sight lines, I think adds a bit. The hesitation I have is basically that I have no idea what the zoo might look like down the line from now, and the idea of trying to add every species probably means that this is going to be a multi-year endeavor. So I wanted to be a little bit careful with the usage of space, but I basically decided to just chuck in some fairly basic looking plant life in the background there, and again just working with guest sightlines. So where there was a slightly larger gap in the view, I just added a slightly bigger tree. But this is a very temporary, potentially, line of foliage, and down the line we may be removing some or all of it just to make things fit in with the lofty goals that we've set. So I did a bit of tidy up with the guest facing area of the habitat, which was just adding some of the old reliable part 2, the scaevola bushes, into the space between them. I thought it looked quite nice. And then we added some more native wildlife into the area around the back. So this front area might be a little more curated by the zoo, and then the more wattle and everything around the back, which I just copied and pasted from the area at the front of the Galapagos tortoise. Some of this wattle and a little bit of the blue stem grass and that type of thing. The staff area around the back is not yet finished, and my plans for that area will involve an entrance that will occur later on in this part of the zoo. So at the time, we just basically have to have it look a little ugly with the entrance there. And again, this is something that you'll see in many work in progress zoos, is that the guest areas look all right, and then you have a really ugly staff area around the back, which over time you can slowly start to tidy up as more of the actual guest area solidifies. So extending out that bamboo thing along the back there is a very similar thing of blocking guest sightlines and preventing it looking like there's just these long unbroken expanses of flat grass, which over time we will fill in those areas, but for now it looks a lot better if we just block that line of sight off, and that'll also help us transition into the next section of the zoo that I have planned. Now, as I finish with some of the last details for the habitat, if you have enjoyed, I have a lot of plans for what we'll be doing next, and I'm really excited for some of those. So if you might like to see those, consider subscribing. And either way, thank you very much for watching, and have a good one.